Frank never found rest again. His porch chair became his post,
You know,
the
this
watch his
drain is
prayer,
actually
the
quite
drain his
interesting.
horizon. His quiet retirement was gone forever, replaced by sleepless
Hey
nights
boy,
and
go get
questions
some
without
help.
answers.
I think I've
The town
fallen and
grew
I can't get
quieter,
up.
lonelier, people
Did
whispered
you
still,
ever think it
but
would
never
come to
aloud.
this?
They avoided the curb, avoided the
What are we
truth,
going to do?
carried their silence like a burden passed down. And on the stillest nights,
I
when the
often
wind
wonder
died
where all this
and the
water
world
goes.
held its breath,
It's quite a
Frank swore
system
he
they
could hear
have
a
here.
slow tapping from beneath the grate, steady, patient, like knuckles against a coffin lid. Each morning, a neighborhood dog stopped at the storm drain, refusing to move. But when someone finally looked inside, what they saw made their blood run cold. Subscribe to the channel and write where you're watching this video from. Frank Miller, 68, retired postman, widower, lives quietly in a small Midwestern town. He thought his days would pass in peace until the dog's strange behavior pulled him into something far darker. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Frank Miller's mornings had followed the same rhythm for years. He would wake before the sun climbed over the trees, shuffle into the kitchen in his worn slippers, and set the kettle on the stove. The sound of it heating, slow and steady, was a comfort. He always poured his coffee into the same chipped mug, the one his late wife, Marianne, had given him. Its faded lettering still read "World's Best Postman," though he'd retired more than a decade ago. After breakfast, he walked the yard. His garden was neat, lined with marigolds and tomatoes. The smell of wet soil lingered from last night's sprinklers, mixing with the sweetness of grass clippings left by a neighbor's mower. He kept his wife's old pocket watch on the porch table while he worked. Its soft ticking was his only company. Frank told himself he listened for it the way some men listened for church bells. Across the street, life went on as it always had. Children rode their bikes in wobbly loops, shouting and laughing. A boy tossed pebbles into the storm drain, amused by the hollow plink as each stone vanished. To most, the drain was nothing, just a rusted grate where runoff disappeared after rain. It sat at the edge of the curb, collecting leaves and candy wrappers, ignored by everyone except the dog. The old shepherd mix from next door, a graying animal with clouded eyes, had made a ritual of stopping at the drain. Every morning, without fail, it would stiffen and stare down through the bars. Sometimes it whined, sometimes it growled low in its throat. Then, as if nothing had happened, it would shuffle along after its owner. Frank noticed it often but never thought much of it. Dogs had their odd ways. They barked at shadows, howled at sirens, and stared at empty corners as if something invisible waited there. This, he told himself, was no different. Yet one warm morning in June, something gave him pause. Frank bent to tie his shoe near the curb, the sun already hot on his shoulders. His fingers brushed against the iron grate, and he flinched. It was cold. Not just cool from shade or dampness, ice cold, as though winter clung to it while the pavement around baked under summer heat. He frowned, straightening slowly, rubbing his hand. Maybe a pipe below carried cold water, or maybe metal held chill longer than stone. Simple explanations came easily. Still, he found himself staring down at the dark slits. A faint tang hung in the air, sharp and metallic, almost like rust carried on damp wind. The dog stopped beside him, as usual. But this time it didn't just stare, it backed away, whining, ears pressed flat. Frank felt an odd weight settle in his chest. He cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. "Nothing there, boy," he muttered. His own voice sounded too loud against the morning silence. He turned to head back toward his porch, coffee still steaming on the table, the watch ticking steadily. Behind him, the dog gave one last low sound, not a bark, not a growl, but something caught between warning and sorrow. Frank hesitated. For the first time, the storm drain no longer looked like a piece of street iron and shadows. The grass surrounding it had changed. He noticed a faint ring of yellow around the grate, the blades brittle as though touched by frost. Everywhere else the lawns were green, lush with summer. But in that perfect circle, the earth seemed tired, drained of life. He stepped back, uneasy, coffee suddenly bitter in his throat. From across the street, a woman called her children inside for breakfast. Birds chattered in the oak trees. The world felt ordinary, unchanged. And yet Frank stood there, staring at the storm drain, pulse quickening without reason. He told himself it was nothing, just a quirk of soil, just a dog's fancy. But as he walked slowly toward his porch, the feeling lingered. The grate behind him seemed to hum with silence, waiting, Frank couldn't shake the image of that yellowed grass ring, circling the storm drain like a warning no one else could see. But soon, small details refused to stay hidden. The following mornings, Frank tried to ignore the drain. He forced his gaze elsewhere toward his tomatoes, the empty mailbox, the sky burning orange at dawn. Still, each time he stepped outside, he caught the dog sitting stiff-legged at the curb, its cloudy eyes fixed on the same grate. At first, Frank muttered excuses. Dogs sense smells people can't. Maybe a raccoon had died down there, or rainwater had left mildew clinging to the pipes. Simple, harmless things. But the longer it went on, the more that explanation soured. One Tuesday, Frank carried out his trash, just as the dog froze again by the curb. He slowed, the bag heavy in his hand. The shepherd wasn't just staring, it was braced, muscles tense, ears forward. The fur along its back stood like a ridge of knives. Frank felt his stomach tighten. "Quit it," he told the dog, his voice sharp, though his throat felt dry. "Ain't nothing down there." The dog didn't blink. Its gaze never left the grate. Frank set the trash by the alley and, against his better judgment, walked closer. He crouched, knees stiff, lowering himself until his face hovered just above the bars. The smell of rust reached him again, faint, metallic, unsettling. His hand brushed the iron rim, and though sunlight beat on his shoulders, his fingers trembled. He swallowed hard, annoyed at himself. His body shouldn't react this way, not over a hunk of metal in the street. Yet his skin prickled as though some current pulsed beneath the ground. He forced himself to lean closer, peering down into the black. For a moment he saw nothing, just wet stone and the faint shimmer of standing water far below. His reflection glinted faintly in the thin surface. An ordinary drain, ordinary, but his heart wouldn't slow. As he straightened, his hand shook against his knee. His legs felt heavier than they should, as if he'd stood from a sickbed. He caught himself muttering under his breath, words meant for no one. Just iron, just pipes. The dog gave a low whine, ears pressed flat. Frank turned quickly, forcing his pace back toward the porch, but even as he walked, the silence behind him felt different, dense, like the air itself pressed too thickly around that patch of street. That night, he tried to chase it from his mind. He heated a can of soup, carried it to his recliner, and turned on the television. The screen flickered, voices rising and fading, but his eyes drifted often to the window, to the faint outline of the street lamp beyond. He thought of Mary Ann, his late wife. She had hated storm drains. Whenever their kids played ball near one, she'd call them back, sharp and anxious. "Not every hole needs looking into," she would say. Frank used to laugh at her fuss. Now, alone, he felt the echo of her words in his chest like a hand pressing down. He switched off the television and sat in silence. Outside, crickets sang. The clock ticked too loud. His stomach felt unsettled. Eventually, he rose, poured himself another coffee, and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was heavy, warm. Across the street, the dog sat in its usual place, as still as stone, eyes fixed forward. Frank rubbed his arms against the sudden chill that came over him. He told himself again to let it go. Whatever bothered the dog was not his concern. But the words felt hollow. The next morning, the unease sharpened. Frank had barely finished his first sip of coffee when he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind brushing through tree branches, but the air outside was still. He leaned forward, frowning, and the sound came again. A metallic scrape, long, harsh, rising from the ground like a knife drawn against stone. His hand tightened around the mug. He stepped out onto the porch, ears straining. The sound had stopped. The street lay quiet, washed in early light. Nothing moved but the dog, shifting uneasily by the curb. Frank swallowed hard. His legs carried him to the sidewalk before his mind could protest. He crouched by the grate once more, lowering his ear. His heart thudded in his throat. For several seconds, there was nothing, just the faint gurgle of water. Then it came again. Scree-each. A sharp, dragging sound, echoing up the tunnel, metallic and raw. Frank stumbled backward, breath-catching. His coffee spilled across the pavement. The dog barked once, loud and panicked, before retreating several steps. Frank's pulse hammered. He pressed a trembling hand against the railing of his porch. It had not been imagination. Something moved beneath the street. Something that scraped metal against metal. Deep in the darkness, no one had thought to look. Frank stood frozen on the curb, mug shattered at his feet, while the storm drain exhaled silence as if waiting for him to lean closer again. By now, denial was no longer enough. Frank woke the next morning with a knot in his stomach. He moved through his routine as always, kettle hissing, coffee mug warming his hands, the pocket watch ticking on the porch table. Yet everything felt different. The quiet was heavier, the air thick with expectation. He tried to keep busy, pulled weeds from the garden, straightened the tools in his shed. But no matter where he turned, his eyes drifted back to the street, to that dark grate waiting at the curb. The dog was already there. It stood rigid, tail low, a faint whine in its throat. Frank watched, his jaw tight, until finally he crossed the yard. His shoes crunched the gravel path, each step louder than it should have been. Up close, the grate seemed even less ordinary. There were scratches etched into the rim, thin but deliberate. They weren't random marks from weather or passing cars. They looked made. A hand, perhaps, or claws. Frank leaned closer, his breath uneven, tracing the lines with his eyes. Some ran straight as if scraped by steady force, others jagged, wild, like panic caught in steel. His skin prickled. He set his palm lightly on the rim, the metal bit cold against his flesh, so sharp he jerked back with a hiss. He glanced around quickly, embarrassed though no one was watching. It was the middle of summer. The pavement around him was warm enough to sting bare feet, yet the drain clung to winter's breath. He rubbed his hand against his trousers, unsettled. A neighbor walked by just then, Mrs. Albright from 2 doors down, tugging her shopping cart. She gave Frank a polite nod, then paused, following his gaze. The dog whined louder, pawing the curb. "Funny thing," she said, adjusting her grip. "That mutt of mine, he'll bark at mailmen, squirrels, even airplanes. But never at people walking by here, only at that drain." Frank forced a laugh, though it caught in his throat. "Dogs are odd," he replied. "Odd, sure." She gave him a long look, then moved on. He turned back to the grate, heart thudding. The smell reached him again, rust, sharp and metallic, but stronger now. It mixed with something else, something sour, faintly chemical, that made him wrinkle his nose. Frank straightened. He should stop. Call the city, maybe. Forget it, maybe. But curiosity pressed harder than sense. He fetched a plastic pitcher from his porch and filled it with water from the hose. Kneeling, he tipped it over the grate. The stream rushed down and vanished. No echo of splash, no gurgle in the pipes. The water seemed to be swallowed whole, as if the space beneath was an open channel, but something else. Frank frowned, pouring more. Again, it disappeared unnaturally fast. It felt wrong, like watching a trick of light where shadows didn't fall where they should. He wiped sweat from his brow. The dog growled low. Then it happened. The ground beneath his knees shivered, subtle at first, like the rumble of a truck blocks away. Frank froze, pitcher tipping from his hand. The water spread across the pavement before slipping between the bars. A hollow clang answered from below, deep, resonant, like heavy steel shifting against stone. Frank stumbled back, nearly falling. The dog barked once, sharp and alarmed, then retreated several steps, tail tucked. The street was empty. No trucks passing, no wind strong enough to rattle signs. Just him, the dog, and the silence that followed the sound. Frank's breathing came fast, ragged. He pressed a hand to his chest, trying to slow it. His mind scrambled for explanation, pipes settling, rusted metal shifting. Something ordinary, it had to be. But the hollow echo replayed in his ears, too deliberate to dismiss. From the porch, the steady ticking of his wife's pocket watch reached him faintly, as if reminding him that time moved on while he stood trapped in place. The world looked unchanged. Children's bikes leaned against porches. Birds chattered overhead, yet the ground beneath his street no longer felt solid. Frank stepped back, eyes locked on the grate. The scratches, the smell, the cold, the way the water vanished, each detail clicked into a picture he didn't want to see. Something waited down there. Something pressed against the dark. Frank stood rooted as the echo faded, the hollow clang still trembling in his bones, as though the street itself had shifted to make room for what lay hidden below. That morning, the ground itself seemed alive. Rain had swept through the night, pounding hard enough to shake windows. By dawn, puddles dotted the street, glinting in pale light. Frank stepped onto his porch with his coffee and froze. The storm drain was rattling. Not just the trickle of water moving through pipes, but a deeper vibration, metal against metal. The grate quivered in place, as though something below pressed upward against it. The old shepherd dog stood rigid nearby, fur raised, a rumble rising low in its chest. Frank's stomach knotted. He set the mug down on the porch rail, wiped his palms against his jeans, and took slow steps toward the curb. Each step felt heavier than the last. The sound grew clearer. A metallic groan, then silence. Another jolt. The grate shivered visibly now, water spilling around its rim. Frank crouched, his breath fogged in the damp air. For a long moment he simply stared, pulse hammering. Every sensible thought screamed at him to walk away. But another part of him, the same part that had carried letters through blizzards and wars, the part that couldn't leave questions unopened, held him there. His hands moved before his mind agreed. The iron grate was heavy, rusted into place by years of weather. Frank fetched a crowbar from his shed, muttering at himself the whole way. He wedged it under the lip, muscles straining. The metal shrieked as it lifted, scraping against stone. His arms burned, breath sharp in his chest. Finally, with a grinding protest, the grate tilted aside. The smell hit him first: wet rust, oil, and something faintly chemical. Not sewer stench, not rot. Industrial. Manufactured. He leaned closer, flashlight trembling in his grip. What he saw stopped his breath. Beneath the opening, where ordinary storm drains should carry water into dark tunnels, lay a structure. Metal beams lined the shaft, welded into place like supports. Farther down, water trickled along the edges, but the center was blocked by something else. A steel hatch. Round, bolted, reinforced. Not a city pipe cover, not anything he'd ever seen in decades of delivering mail across counties and towns. Its surface was dark, wet with condensation, but etched into the metal were numbers faded, but deliberate. A sequence, like an identification code. Frank's mouth went dry. His hand shook so badly the flashlight beam jittered across the steel surface. The dog whined sharply behind him, claws scraping pavement. He whispered without meaning to, "What in God's name?" He lowered himself further, knees aching, peering as far as the shaft allowed. The hatch wasn't alone. Metal piping ran across it in strange angles, like conduits leading somewhere deeper. Weld marks scarred its edges, sealing it closed. It wasn't built to drain rainwater. It was built to keep something in. Frank staggered back, nearly slipping on the wet curb. His chest heaved as though he'd run a mile. He pressed a hand to his face, trying to ground himself. The cold, damp air stung his lungs. The world around him remained unchanged, the street, the houses, the birds beginning to sing again. But for Frank, everything had shifted. His wife's voice came back to him clearer than ever. Not every door should be opened. He wanted to slam the grate back into place, forget what he had seen, pretend it had never been there, but the image of that steel hatch glowed behind his eyes like a brand. Questions flooded faster than sense. Who had put it there? How long had it been sealed? Why beneath this street, this drain? And why did only the dog seem to know? He gripped the crowbar tighter, knuckles white. A part of him, stubborn and reckless, considered prying deeper, finding a way to open that hatch. But a stronger part recoiled, afraid of what waited on the other side. The dog barked once, sharp and frantic, snapping him from his spiral. Frank shoved the grate back into place, the clang echoing down the street. His breath tore in his throat. He straightened slowly, legs shaking, and looked around. The neighborhood remained calm. Curtains twitched in one window. A car rolled lazily by. To anyone else, nothing had happened. But Frank's world had tilted. He stared at the drain one last time before backing away. He could still see the etched numbers, the welded seams, the way the steel hatch gleamed faintly in the dark. Something was hidden there, sealed, waiting. Frank returned to his porch. But the image refused to leave him an underground door beneath his quiet street, closed for decades, daring him to open it. Would you call for help if you saw the ground breathing? But the discovery refused to stay buried. All day, Frank tried to busy himself. He swept the porch, clipped the marigolds, even sorted through a box of old mail he'd meant to toss years ago. But nothing held his attention. Each time he paused, his mind returned to the hatch, the way it gleamed under his flashlight, the numbers etched like a code no one was meant to read. By dusk, he'd stopped pretending. He sat on his porch with the pocket watch ticking beside him, staring across the street. The dog hadn't moved from its spot near the curb. Its eyes never strayed from the drain. Frank's chest tightened. You should have left it, he told himself. Should have never touched it. When night fell, the silence pressed heavier than usual. Frank locked the doors, pulled the curtains, and tried to sleep. But every time he shut his eyes, he saw the steel hatch waiting in the dark. His wife's voice echoed clearer than ever. Not every door should be opened. He rolled over in bed, restless. The clock ticked too loud. The sheets twisted around his legs. Then came the sound. A hollow, muffled thud. Frank sat up, heart pounding. He held his breath, ears straining. The house creaked, old wood shifting, but underneath it, yes, there again. A deep, distant thump, like pressure slamming against steel. His pulse raced. He shoved the blanket aside and stood barefoot on the cold floorboards. Every step toward the window felt like walking into danger. He pulled the curtain back just a sliver. The street lay silent under moonlight. No cars, no people. Just the drain, sitting black and still in the middle of the curb. The dog was there too, lying in the grass, head low but eyes open, watching. Frank swallowed, throat dry. The sound didn't come again, only silence. He dropped the curtain and leaned against the wall, heart hammering. He felt foolish, terrified by echoes. Yet his skin crawled, and the memory of the hatch burned too fresh to ignore. He went back to bed, though sleep never came. He drifted in and out, half dreaming. In one dream he saw the drain opening wide, a spiral staircase descending into endless dark. In another, the hatch unsealed itself with a hiss, steam pouring upward while unseen voices murmured. Each time he startled awake, sweat dampening his shirt. Hours crawled by. Midnight, 1 o'clock, 2. The house felt too quiet, every creak amplified. He thought of the years delivering mail before dawn, walking quiet streets just like this one. Except those mornings had felt safe. This one didn't. At last, exhaustion blurred his senses. He dozed in the chair by his window, the pocket watch ticking in his palm. That was when it came again. A sharper sound this time, not a creak, not a settling pipe, a bang, hollow, forceful, rolling up from beneath the street. The glass panes rattled in their frames. The floor beneath his feet seemed to tremble ever so slightly, as if some pressure rolled beneath the asphalt. Frank bolted upright. The dog outside erupted in frantic barking, claws scrabbling against the curb. For a long moment, Frank could only stare at the dark shape of the drain under the street lamp. His breath caught, lungs refusing to move. His heart thundered in his ears. Then silence returned. The dog whined low, circling once before lying down again, still watching. Frank sank back into the chair, gripping the pocket watch so hard the metal cut into his palm. He had never felt more awake, more alert, yet more helpless. There was something alive beneath his street, something sealed away, pressing against the world above. Frank sat rigid in the chair until dawn, unable to close his eyes, while the memory of that bang lingered in his bones, proof that the hatch wasn't just a relic, but a barrier holding something back. By morning, Frank was no longer the only one who noticed. He hadn't slept more than an hour when the sun finally climbed over the rooftops. His body ached from the chair, but he couldn't bring himself to step away from the window. The dog was still there, lying stiff in the grass near the curb. Its eyes, cloudy but sharp, hadn't moved from the storm drain all night. Frank rubbed his face and stepped outside. The air felt heavy, damp with last night's rain. He glanced at the street, half expecting to see the grate quiver again. But it sat silent, dark, as though mocking him with its stillness. He turned to fetch the newspaper, but voices carried from down the block. Mrs. Albright, the widow with the shopping cart, was speaking with another neighbor near the fence. Frank caught his name whispered, then saw their eyes dart toward the curb. The dog had risen now, pacing back and forth, nose low, whining. Mrs. Albright shook her head. "Never seen an animal act like that," she muttered. Her voice carried clearer than she meant. "Not since, not since my father warned me about that drain." Frank froze mid-step. The other neighbor frowned. "Warned you?" She noticed Frank listening and quickly pushed her cart away, muttering about groceries. The other man lingered a moment, gave Frank a thin nod, then followed her. Frank's stomach tightened. He wanted to call after her, ask what she meant, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he turned back toward the drain. The dog's whine rose again, almost a cry this time. Its paws scratched at the edge of the curb, as though trying to dig, but it never got closer than a foot from the grate. Frank's pulse quickened. Later that afternoon, as he trimmed the garden, he overheard two teenagers passing on bikes. They slowed near the curb, pointing. "That's the one said. "My brother swears he heard something last night, like metal slamming shut." The other snorted. "Yeah, right. It's just pipes." "Then why'd Dad tell us not to mess with it?" Their voices faded as they pedaled off, but Frank's hands trembled on the clippers. The blades snipped unevenly through the marigolds, petals falling like torn paper. By evening, whispers seemed to follow him. On his walk to the corner store, he felt eyes linger too long. People nodded politely, but their gazes slipped toward the storm drain as if it had grown teeth. Inside the store, old Mr. Clayton leaned against the counter, his cane tapping the tile. He squinted at Frank, then at the street outside. "You've been poking around the wrong place," Clayton said quietly. His voice was rough, worn with years. "Some things are left shut for a reason." Frank swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" But the old man just shook his head, his lips tightening around unspoken words. On his way back, Frank passed the fence, where Mrs. Albright now stood with her small dog. She avoided his eyes, but her dog barked frantically toward the grate, straining at the leash. She tugged it back, face pale. "Don't let curiosity eat at you, Mr. Miller," she said suddenly, voice low, almost trembling. "It's not good for a man alone." Frank opened his mouth, but she turned quickly and shut her door before he could answer. He stood rooted for a long moment, her words gnawing at him. When he finally returned to his porch, the shepherd was still there, its ears pricked, staring at the grate. Frank sat heavily in his chair, pocket watch ticking in his palm. For the first time, the street didn't feel like home. It felt like a stage, every house watching, every neighbor whispering. And at the center of it all lay the drain, ordinary to anyone who hadn't looked close, yet terrifying to those who had. He tried to sip his coffee, but it tasted sour. He set the mug aside, heart restless. As dusk fell, the whispers sharpened. He caught fragments from passing neighbors, words carried by the wind. "My father said, better to leave it." Not the first time. Frank gripped the armrest of his chair until his knuckles whitened. The weight of silence pressed heavier than the voices. Then came the worst of it. Two men paused at the corner, talking low but urgent. Frank couldn't hear every word, but one phrase cut clear enough. "He's stirring up something best left alone." The dog barked sharply, startling him. It circled once, then sat back at its vigil, staring into the grate as if guarding against something waiting below. Frank followed its gaze, throat dry, pulse uneven. For the first time, Frank realized the secret wasn't his alone. The whole neighborhood knew more than they admitted, and their silence felt more dangerous than the hatch itself. The secret was no longer his alone. By the next morning, the whispers had become louder than birdsong. Curtains stirred when Frank stepped onto his porch. Children played farther down the block, away from the curb. The storm drain, silent and black, had become a wound everyone pretended not to see. But someone had talked. Frank knew it the moment the sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly up the street, tires crunching against the gravel. Sheriff Dalton climbed out, a tall man with a thinning mustache and a frame that once looked strong but now sagged with age. He adjusted his belt, his eyes fixed not on Frank, but on the drain. Frank set his coffee down, heart sinking. "Morning, Frank," Dalton said, though his voice was tighter than usual. "Mornin'," Frank answered, wary. "Something I can help you with." The sheriff's gaze lingered on the grate. His jaw worked as if chewing on words. Finally, he stepped closer, squatted down, and touched the rim. His hand recoiled, almost instantly. "Colder than it should be," Dalton muttered, more to himself than to Frank. Frank stiffened. He hadn't told anyone about that. The sheriff stood, brushing his hands on his trousers. He looked around, as if checking who might be watching from behind their curtains. Several windows twitched shut. "You've been poking around down here?" Dalton asked. Frank's mouth felt dry. "Just curiosity. It's on my street, after all." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, then softened into something almost weary. "Curiosity gets men hurt." He glanced at the dog, which was pacing again, low growl in its throat. "What is it?" Frank asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Dalton didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched again, peered through the bars, his breath fogged in the cool air above the grate. Finally, he stood and rubbed the back of his neck. "I'll call someone out here," he said quietly. "Not city workers. Someone else." Frank frowned. What do you mean, someone else? The sheriff met his eyes for a moment, then looked away, gaze fixed on the houses watching them. His lips pressed tight, as though he'd already said too much. You'll see, he muttered, but don't expect them to keep notes. Frank's chest tightened. Sheriff, what are you not telling me? Dalton didn't answer. He started back toward his cruiser, but his pace was slower now, heavier, as if the act of leaving cost him. At the car door, he paused. For a moment, he looked back at Frank not with authority, but with something close to guilt. Then he slid behind the wheel and drove off without another word. The silence he left behind was worse than the noise. Frank stood there, palms clammy, watching the cruiser disappear around the corner. The dog sat at the curb, still staring into the grate. The street felt emptier than ever. By noon, the whispers had grown again. Neighbors lingered in small groups, voices low. Frank caught fragments as he passed. Sheriff came. City won't touch it, not the first time. Every word tightened the knot in his gut. He tried to clear his head by working in the garden, but even there, he couldn't escape it. The ground beneath his hands felt too firm, as though something pressed back from below. The smell of soil was tainted with that metallic tang that seemed stronger now, drifting on the wind. Frank straightened, wiping dirt from his palms. His house, his street, even his own yard, none of it felt safe anymore. The sheriff knew something, everyone did, and yet they spoke in riddles, half-words and warnings, leaving him stranded between fear and ignorance. As dusk settled, the dog barked sharply, startling him. He looked up just in time to see a shadow cross the street Mrs. Albright again, clutching her shopping cart. She paused, her eyes darting to the drain, then to Frank. You be careful, Mr. Miller, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff's hands are dirtier than that water. Before Frank could respond, she hurried off into the night. Frank stood frozen, her words echoing in his mind. Dirtier than that water. He sat on the porch long after dark, pocket watch ticking in his hand, the drain gleaming faintly under the street lamp. He couldn't shake the sheriff's look before he left that flicker of guilt, of knowledge withheld. When Frank finally rose to go inside, he turned once more toward the drain. For just a second, he swore the grate shifted, ever so slightly, as though something below had rolled against it, waiting. Now the law stood at his fence line. Frank had barely finished his morning coffee when the rumble of engines reached him. He stepped onto the porch and saw 2 county trucks crawling up the street. Sheriff Dalton's cruiser followed behind, lights off, moving slow. The neighbors' curtains twitched, heads vanishing back into shadow as the convoy stopped in front of Frank's house. Dalton climbed out first, jaw tight, his eyes darting quickly to the houses lining the block. Then he waved at the trucks. 2 deputies unloaded equipment Frank had never seen before. Long metal rods, handheld scanners, and heavy drills bolted to wheeled carts. Frank's stomach dropped. What's all this? He asked, forcing his voice steady. Routine inspection, Dalton said too quickly. Storm system check. Happens every few years. Frank frowned. Never seen it happen in 30. Dalton didn't meet his eyes. He motioned to his deputy, a younger man named Carter, who crouched by the grate. Carter pressed a scanner against the iron bars, its screen flickering with green numbers. His brow furrowed as he leaned closer. Sheriff, Carter said quietly, this isn't standard. Keep your voice down, Dalton muttered. Frank stepped closer, his chest tight. What isn't standard? Dalton turned sharply, his face stern. Stay on your porch, Frank. But Carter couldn't hide his unease. He stood, wiping his palms on his uniform. Sir, there's no schematic match. Nothing here lines up with county records. Frank's heart pounded. He looked at Dalton, waiting for explanation. The sheriff's face was pale. I said keep it quiet. Carter hesitated, then bent again, tapping the scanner. Something sealed down there, big, solid, like reinforced plating. The dog barked suddenly, frantic, claws scraping against the pavement as if to dig through. Its owner tugged helplessly at the leash from down the block, but the dog wouldn't move, wouldn't break its stare. Dalton straightened, eyes hard. He turned to Frank. Whatever you think you saw, forget it. It's nothing. Frank felt anger flare through his fear. Nothing? You've got machines saying different. The sheriff's jaw tightened. I said forget it. Neighbors had gathered now, silent clusters at the ends of their lawns, whispering behind cupped hands. A young boy darted forward on his bike, craning for a look, until his mother yanked him back by the arm. The sound of metal shrieked suddenly as one of the workers positioned a drill above the pavement. The whine filled the air, high-pitched, grating, echoing down the street. Frank's teeth clenched at the noise. Dalton paced, barking instructions low. Slow, controlled. Don't breach more than the surface layer. Frank's chest tightened. They weren't here to inspect. They were here to open. Carter crouched beside the sheriff again. Sir, with respect, this isn't safe. If that's pressure sealed. Dalton cut him off with a glare. Do your job, deputy. Frank stepped off his porch, voice rising. Sheriff, tell me what's down there. Dalton turned, his face hard as stone. You don't want to know. The words hit Frank like a slap. The drill whined louder, biting into the asphalt above the drain. Dust rose in pale clouds, settling on shoes, on grass, on Frank's trembling hands. The dog howled, a sound too raw, too human in its desperation. Frank backed a step, pulse hammering. He wanted to run, to shut his door and never look again, but he couldn't. His eyes were fixed on the grate, on the way the workers strained to break through. Behind him, whispers rippled among the neighbors. Someone muttered about old maps. Someone else hissed, "This is how it starts." Frank's throat tightened. His wife's voice echoed again in memory. Not every door should be opened, but the sheriff was opening it anyway. The drill struck something solid, sending a jolt through the ground. The sound that followed was worse, a hollow vibration that hummed low, resonant, spreading through Frank's shoes, into his bones. The workers froze. Carter's face drained of color. Sheriff, he whispered, that's not piping, that's a chamber. Dalton's voice dropped to a growl. Stay focused. Frank's breath caught. A chamber. Sealed. Waiting. He felt the truth pressing against him like weight, like the air itself had grown heavy. The drill screamed again, sparks spitting, as the first cracks split across the street. The ground itself seemed ready to give way. Do you think this is natural, or something far darker? What the experts saw made their faces turn pale. The drill's shriek cut off suddenly, leaving only the hiss of dust in the air. The ground trembled once, then split with a crack loud enough to echo down the block. Asphalt buckled in jagged lines, spilling chips across the curb. Frank stumbled back, shielding his face. The dog barked frantically, straining at its leash, while neighbors gasped from behind fences. Carter, the young deputy, stepped forward cautiously. He knelt by the fractured pavement and brushed dust aside with a gloved hand. Beneath the thin layer of broken asphalt lay a sheet of steel, dark, riveted, unmarked by time. Sheriff, he whispered, voice tight, this isn't drainage. Dalton's jaw worked. His face was gray in the afternoon light. Seal the area, nobody touches it. But the workers were already staring. The steel wasn't a pipe cover. It wasn't city infrastructure at all. It stretched wider than the grate, thick and solid, like the roof of a buried vault. Frank's breath hitched. His mind flashed back to the numbers he'd seen when he pried open the grate. Codes etched in steel, a hatch welded shut. Now the truth loomed at the surface. Carter pressed his ear close, as if listening. His expression shifted, eyes widening. There's a hum, he muttered. Something's running down there. The sheriff's head snapped toward him. You didn't hear anything. But Frank had heard it too, the faint, mechanical vibration humming low through the soles of his shoes. His pulse pounded with it, sinking to the rhythm. What is this? Frank demanded, his voice shaking with anger. What's buried under my street? Dalton turned on him, eyes sharp. Go inside, Frank. I won't, his fists clenched. Not till you tell me what that island. For a long moment, the sheriff just stared at him, jaw clenched. Then, under his breath, he muttered words not meant to be heard. This was never supposed to be found. The phrase struck Frank like a blow. He staggered, staring at the man he'd trusted for years. The neighbors behind the fences stirred, whispers hissing louder. Someone gasped. Dalton realized too late he'd spoken aloud. His lips tightened, but the damage was done. Carter rose, face pale. Sir, if something's active down there. Enough. Dalton's voice was sharp, but his eyes betrayed fear. The workers shifted uneasily, muttering among themselves. One man spat in the dirt, another crossed himself. They were supposed to be digging pipes, not unsealing whatever lay under a small-town street. The dog howled again, long and mournful, its voice carrying through the block. Curtains twitched open. More faces appeared in windows. Soon the whole street was watching. Dalton barked at the workers. "Cover it back up. Now." But Carter shook his head. "Sheriff, with respect, it's too big. Whatever's down there, it wasn't meant for us to hide with asphalt." Frank's throat tightened. His mind ran wild with possibilities, old military projects, war bunkers, forgotten experiments. He'd lived through enough years to know the government buried things it didn't want ordinary people to find. And now, one of them sat beneath his porch light. The sheriff turned away, muttering to himself, hands trembling as he lit a cigarette he didn't smoke. Frank stepped closer to the fracture, peering down. The steel surface below gleamed faintly, dotted with rivets, scarred with weld lines. It wasn't just a lid, it was a door. He could almost feel the weight of it pressing upward, not to be opened, but not to be forgotten either. The humming grew louder in his imagination, filling his ears until he wasn't sure if the sound was real or just inside his head. Around him, the neighbors whispered louder. "Not supposed to be found." "What's running down there?" "Why here? Why our street?" Frank's chest heaved. The world tilted, ordinary houses surrounding him, but the truth yawning wider beneath his feet. He pressed a hand to the railing for balance. Dalton flicked ash to the ground, his voice low and hard. "Go home, Frank, for your own good." But Frank couldn't. Not after what he'd seen, not after what he'd heard. The ground beneath them all was no longer solid. It was hollow, humming with secrets. The workers froze as another vibration rippled upward, faint, steady, mechanical, as though somewhere deep below, a machine that should have died decades ago was still alive. By nightfall, the whole town was talking. The crack in the street hadn't been covered. Workers had abandoned their drills, and the steel surface below gleamed faintly under the street lamp like a wound no one could stitch. By morning, word had spread faster than Frank thought possible. When he stepped onto his porch, the quiet neighborhood he'd known for decades was gone. Vans lined the block, tires muddy from the fields outside town. Strangers milled about with cameras and microphones. Voices rose in excited tones, some fearful, others hungry for a story. Frank blinked, stunned. His street was a spectacle. A reporter in a Navy windbreaker waved at him. "Mr. Miller, is it true you found the hatch yourself? Did you hear noises before the discovery?" Before he could answer, another voice shouted, "Sir, do you believe this is government property? Some say it's a Cold War cache. Care to comment?" Frank stepped back toward his door, chest tight. His porch, his sanctuary, had become a stage. Flashbulbs lit his face, burning his eyes. The neighbors watched from their lawns, half curious, half afraid. Some leaned into the chaos, whispering rumors to strangers. Others shook their heads, retreating behind closed doors. But no one ignored it. Not anymore. Frank's pulse pounded. He wanted to shout, to drive them all away. But the words stuck. Instead, he gripped the railing, his knuckles white. His wife's pocket watch ticked faintly in his palm, the rhythm drowned by the noise. "Frank, tell them what you saw," a voice called. He turned to see Mrs. Albright standing stiffly by her fence, eyes wide. But even she didn't step closer. She wanted him to speak while she remained safely in the shadows. His stomach twisted with humiliation. They weren't here for him. They were here for the whole, for the story, and he had become nothing more than its messenger. The sheriff returned in the afternoon, but his presence did little to settle the frenzy. He barked at reporters to move back, ordered the workers to secure the site. But every command was drowned by the whir of cameras and the chatter of voices. "Sheriff Dalton," one reporter shouted, "is it true this site isn't on county records?" Dalton ignored him, jaw set, sweat glistening on his forehead. He barked again. "Fence it off. Tonight." Frank's chest tightened. Fence it off. Seal it again. Pretend it wasn't there. That was the plan. But the people weren't fooled. Rumors ran faster than orders. A college student with a backpack scribbled notes furiously, muttering about Cold War bunkers. A gray-haired man insisted it was a weapons cache, hidden in case of Soviet invasion. A young woman in a denim jacket live-streamed, declaring it proof of secret experiments. Frank felt the ground tilting beneath him. Every wild theory made the truth heavier. The dog barked suddenly, frantic, straining toward the grate. Cameras swung instantly, capturing the animal's fury. Reporters gasped, hungry for drama. One man crouched, shoving a microphone toward the growling dog as though it might speak. Frank snapped, "Leave him alone!" His voice cracked, raw with anger. "It's not a show." The crowd turned, cameras flashing, recording his outburst. Frank's cheeks burned hot. He felt stripped bare, his grief, his fear, his solitude broadcast like cheap entertainment. Dalton shoved through the reporters, his face like stone. "Enough! Clear the area, now!" The deputies worked fast, rolling heavy fencing from the trucks. By dusk, they'd cordoned off the street, barbed wire crowning the barrier. The steel beneath the crack lay hidden now, locked away. The reporters lingered on the other side, cameras still rolling, voices still clamoring. But the street beyond the fence felt empty, stripped of its ordinary life. Frank stood behind the barrier, his home trapped inside the zone. His neighbors whispered from their porches, unsure whether to step closer or farther away. His chest ached with shame. His life was no longer his own. As night fell, the street lamps flickered on, casting long shadows across the fence. The crowd thinned but didn't vanish. A few vans still hummed in the distance. A low murmur of voices drifted through the dark. Frank sat on his porch, pocket watch heavy in his hand, staring at the barbed wire cutting his street in two. The drain, once ignored, had swallowed his peace whole. When the last reporter's van rolled away, Frank realized the fence wasn't there to keep people out. It was there to keep something in. Then came the men who spoke in whispers. Frank first heard them before he saw them. Engines low, powerful, smoother than the county trucks. By mid-morning, 3 black SUVs rolled down the street, windows tinted so dark the houses reflected back like mirrors. The crowd of reporters surged, cameras flashing, but the vehicles didn't slow. They glided past, silent, and stopped at the fence. Doors opened in unison. Men in dark suits stepped out, their shoes gleaming despite the mud. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't flash badges. But everyone on the street seemed to know exactly what they were. The reporters shouted questions, "Are you federal? What's under there?" But the men ignored them. They moved with practiced precision, scanning the crowd, then the fence, then the crack in the asphalt where steel still glinted faintly below. Frank stood frozen on his porch, his stomach turned cold. One of the suits spoke briefly with Sheriff Dalton, voice low, lips barely moving. Dalton nodded stiffly, wiping sweat from his temple. Whatever was said, it wasn't meant for anyone else. Within minutes, the tone shifted. Reporters were pushed back, their cameras turned away. Deputies set up heavier barricades, blocking not just the street but both ends of the block. A helicopter circled once, then disappeared, leaving only the low hum of generators the suits had brought with them. Frank's neighbors retreated behind their doors. Curtains snapped shut. The street that had been buzzing with chaos only a day before now felt eerily quiet, emptied of ordinary life. Frank stayed on his porch, pocket watch in hand. He felt smaller than he had in years. His street was no longer his. One of the men finally approached. His suit was immaculate, his tie knotted tight, his expression unreadable. He stopped at Frank's steps, looked him over, then said in a voice barely above a whisper, "You need to forget what you saw." Frank's throat tightened. "Forget? How am I supposed to forget that?" The man's gaze didn't waver. "Because your life will be easier if you do." The words weren't a threat on the surface, but the weight behind them pressed heavier than a shout. Frank gripped the watch tighter. "This is my street, my home. I have a right to know." "You have the right," the man interrupted calmly, "to live out your years in peace, that's all." Then he turned and walked away. Frank sank into his chair, his body trembling. He stared at the drain, now hidden behind fences and guarded by men with earpieces. He felt less like a witness than a prisoner. As the day dragged on, the cover-up deepened. Trucks unloaded sheets of tarpaulin, draping them over the cracked asphalt. The hum from below seemed louder in Frank's imagination, but the suits spoke as if nothing unusual existed. "Routine maintenance," they told the reporters. "City upgrade," they told the neighbors. Nothing to see here. But there was everything to see, and Frank had seen too much already. That night, unable to sleep, he stepped onto the porch. The street was dark except for the glow of work lights. Men stood in clusters, talking in hushed tones, their faces pale under the artificial glare. And there, apart from them, leaned Sheriff Dalton. He stood by the fence, cigarette burning between his fingers, the smoke curling upward. His eyes never met Frank's. When Frank finally called softly Dalton, the sheriff flicked the cigarette away, turned, and disappeared into the shadows without a word. Frank's chest tightened. The silence was worse than denial. The sheriff knew. He had always known. The pocket watch ticked in Frank's hand, each second louder than the last. For the first time, Frank realized the real danger wasn't what lay beneath the street, but the people above it, determined to keep it buried. Every shadow now felt like a watcher. Frank noticed it first in the smallest ways. His mailbox leaned crooked one morning, its door bent as though pried open. No letters missing, just disturbed like someone wanted him to know they'd been there. That night, the phone rang once, no caller ID, before cutting off into static. He told himself it was coincidence, until the SUV appeared. It was parked half a block away, glossy black under the street lamp, its windows dark. Frank watched from behind his curtain, heart pounding. The engine never ran. No one stepped out. But the car stayed until dawn, then vanished without a sound. The next night, it came back. Frank sat in his chair with the pocket watch in his hand, ticking steady, his only anchor. He thought of Marianne, how she'd warned him not to let curiosity turn to obsession. But what choice did he have now? He was caught in something he hadn't asked for, a secret forced into his life like an infection. The dog outside barked suddenly, its voice sharp, panicked. Frank opened the curtain wider. The car was gone. The drain sat under the streetlight, fenced and tarped, yet the dog paced wildly, growling low. The ground trembled faintly, or maybe Frank only imagined it. By morning, paranoia dug deeper. He walked to the corner store and felt eyes on his back. A man lingered by the newspaper rack too long, never buying anything. Another shuffled past him on the sidewalk, murmuring something Frank couldn't catch, just fragments. Don't stir it. Too late now. His chest tightened. That night, sleep was impossible. Each creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Each flicker of shadow on the wall seemed deliberate. He turned the pocket watch over in his hand, rubbing the smooth silver, remembering Marianne's voice. Not every door should be opened. He closed his eyes and saw Vietnam again, the years he tried not to remember. Back then, orders came sealed in envelopes, truth buried under codes and silence. He had seen villages burned, men silenced for asking too many questions, secrets that destroyed families, left scars no one spoke of. Now the same weight pressed on his street, on his chest. At 3 a.m, he heard movement outside. He rose, crept to the window. A figure stood by his fence, tall, motionless. Smoke curled faintly in the air. For a moment Frank thought it was Dalton, but when he blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only the acrid smell of cigarette ash. His pulse hammered. The dog whined again, pawing the ground near the fence. Beneath the tarp, something gave a faint, hollow knock. Once. Then silence. Frank staggered back from the window, clutching the watch. He felt trapped, pulled in two directions. If he spoke, if he told the truth, he'd be silenced, maybe worse. But if he stayed quiet, the secret would remain buried, festering, waiting to swallow more than just his peace. The choice weighed heavier than the years on his shoulders. He sank into his chair, trembling, and whispered to the watch as though speaking to Marianne herself. She'd tell me to walk away, he muttered, voice breaking. But what if walking away buries the truth forever? Frank sat in the dark, torn between survival and truth, knowing that whichever choice he made, something or someone was waiting to make him pay. If this happened to you, what would you do? And then the last secret broke free. The black SUVs returned at dawn, this time in greater numbers. Men in suits strung heavier tarps, rolled out generators, and set up floodlights that bleached the street in harsh white glow. The whole block hummed with forced silence, like a stage set for something no one wanted to witness. Frank sat rigid on his porch, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. The dog lay in the grass, unmoving, its cloudy eyes fixed as ever on the drain. Then he saw Dalton. The sheriff stood apart from the suits, his hat low over his brow, hands shoved into his pockets. He looked smaller than Frank had ever seen him, a man shrunk by his own secrets. Frank crossed the yard before he could think better of it. "Dalton," he said sharply, low enough not to carry, "tell me the truth." The sheriff didn't answer. He lit a cigarette instead, the flame trembling against his thumb. His eyes darted to the men at the fence, then back to Frank. "You already know too much," Dalton muttered. Frank's jaw tightened. Then tell me why. Why is this here? Why cover it up? Dalton's shoulders slumped. He drew deeply on the cigarette, exhaled, and spoke in a whisper that tasted of ash. Cold War, back in the 60s. They built things underground. Experiments, they called them. Facilities buried where no one would think to look. Our town got one of them. Frank's stomach turned. Experiments? On what? Dalton's gaze flicked away. Not what, who. The words hit Frank harder than any shout. Dalton continued, voice low, cracking. Prisoners, drifters, even folks that wouldn't be missed. They said it was for defense, figuring how much the human body could endure. Some didn't come back up. Frank felt the ground tilt beneath him. His pulse thundered in his ears. And you knew? Dalton's lips trembled. He dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his heel. My daddy was sheriff before me. He was told to keep it quiet. When he passed, it fell to me. Orders came down. Don't ask, don't dig, don't tell. Just keep folks away from the drains. Frank staggered a step back, the air thick in his lungs. The neighbors' whispers, the warnings, the silences, they weren't fear of superstition. They were fear of truth. Behind them, a worker shouted. A section of the tarp had slipped, exposing the steel surface below. Carved into its edge were more numbers, and beneath them, letters stamped deep. Property of us defense. Classified. Gasps rippled from the crowd that had gathered beyond the barricades. Someone snapped a photo before being shoved back. The dog howled, the sound splitting the air like grief itself. Frank grabbed Dalton's arm, voice shaking. You let this sit under our homes. You let them bury people under our street. Dalton wrenched free, his face twisted with something between shame and anger. You think I wanted this? I was told if it ever came out, this town would be wiped clean. No one spared, so I kept my mouth shut. We all did. Frank reeled. The pocket watch ticked furiously in his palm, Marianne's memory anchoring him as rage surged. What else? He demanded. Dalton hesitated too long. Finally his eyes lifted, haunted. This isn't the only one. There are more. Dozens, across counties, states, all sealed the same way. The words spread like fire. Neighbors gasped, muttering, their fear no longer contained. Some crossed themselves, others shook their heads in denial. The suits rushed to resecure the tarp, barking orders into radios. But the damage was done. The secret was no longer rumor, it was exposed, undeniable. Frank felt hollow. Everything he'd known about his quiet street, his safe retirement, his small town, it had all been built on top of silence and bones. Dalton stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. You don't understand, Frank. Some things aren't meant to be dug up. You start talking, and you'll end worse than the ones buried down there. Frank met his eyes, trembling. And if we stay silent, it happens again. Dalton flinched as though struck. For the first time, Frank saw tears brimming in the sheriff's eyes, shining against the floodlights. The hum rose again beneath the ground, faint but steady, vibrating through the soles of their shoes. Everyone felt it this time. The crowd fell silent, breathless, as if the earth itself had stirred in answer to its exposure. Frank stared at the sheriff, the crowd, the trembling steel beneath their feet. The truth was no longer just his, no longer just theirs. It stretched across towns, across states, and nobody knew how many more hatches still waited, sealed and forgotten, under America's quiet streets. But some secrets never truly stay buried. When the floodlights came down and the last tarp was stretched tight, Frank's street no longer felt like his own. Black SUVs still lurked at both ends, their engines purring low, but the media had been pushed out, the neighbors worn silent. By dawn, the block looked quiet again, too quiet, like a grave after the mourners leave. Frank sat on his porch, staring at the cracked pavement, hidden now under layers of steel and canvas. His pocket watch ticked faintly in his palm, the rhythm of Marianne's memory steady against the storm inside him. He had lived here for 30 years, walked this street every day, never once suspecting the ground beneath his feet carried such weight. Now, he couldn't step outside without feeling it. The dog was still there, lying in the grass as if nothing had changed, yet its cloudy eyes never strayed from the drain. Its vigil was endless, unbroken, as though it understood more than any of them. Frank sometimes wished he could see what it saw, or feared he already did. The neighborhood had changed too. People spoke less, walked faster. Some crossed the street rather than passed near Frank's curb. Others looked at him with pity or resentment, as though he had dragged the town's hidden sickness into the light. Children no longer tossed pebbles into the grate. Their parents pulled them inside before dusk. And in the quiet of evening, Frank swore he could hear voices from porches, whispered fragments carried on the breeze. Should have kept it shut. Never safe now. More of them, everywhere. The sheriff still passed by sometimes, though never alone. He didn't stop to talk, not anymore. He walked with the suits, his head down, eyes refusing to meet Frank's. The guilt that had once flickered openly was now buried under layers of duty, or fear, or both. Frank tried to hold on to routine. He tended his tomatoes, swept the porch, brewed his morning coffee. But every sound carried a new weight. A car door slamming made him flinch. A knock at the mailbox felt like intrusion. And every night, as the clock ticked and the dog shifted restlessly across the street, Frank sat with the pocket watch clutched in his hand, wondering if silence was protection or punishment. The media circus faded, but the questions didn't. Articles appeared online, quickly taken down. Headlines whispered about classified installations and Cold War relics. Conspiracy forums lit up, speculating about human trials, forgotten projects, the possibility of more hatches sealed across the country. Frank never clicked the links, but sometimes the words reached him anyway, carried in hushed conversations at the store, or folded into notes slipped through his mailbox before vanishing the next morning. He thought about selling the house, moving somewhere far. But where could he go? If more hatches existed, if they waited beneath other towns, then nowhere was untouched, nowhere was safe. So he stayed. Weeks passed, then months. The tarps were replaced with new steel plating. The street resurfaced, the crack erased. To the unknowing eye, it looked like nothing had ever happened. Grass grew back around the curb, green and neat. The hum beneath the ground was gone, or perhaps only hidden deeper. But Frank knew, and the neighbors knew, and the dog never stopped staring. One evening, as autumn leaves skittered across the pavement, Frank sat with his coffee and watched children ride past on bikes. They kept to the far side of the street, their laughter brittle, forced. A mother stood at the corner, her eyes darting often toward the drain. Frank felt the weight of her fear pressing against his own. The world above carried on, pretending. But below, silence waited. Frank touched the pocket watch, running his thumb over its worn silver. Marianne's words haunted him more now than ever. Not every door should be opened. He understood them differently now, not as warning, but as confession. Maybe she had known more than she ever admitted. Maybe everyone had. As the sun dipped low and the streetlights buzzed awake, the dog rose suddenly and gave a single bark. Frank's head snapped toward the drain, breath caught in his throat. Nothing moved. The grate lay still, the pavement smooth, the air silent, and yet his skin prickled. He closed his eyes, pressing the watch tight in his hand, willing himself to believe it was only memory, only nerves. But deep down, he knew better. Character closure. Frank never found rest again. His porch chair became his post, the watch his prayer, the drain his horizon. His quiet retirement was gone forever, replaced by sleepless nights and questions without answers. The town grew quieter, lonelier. People whispered still, but never aloud. They avoided the curb, avoided the truth, carried their silence like a burden passed down. And on the stillest nights, when the wind died and the world held its breath, Frank swore he could hear a slow tapping from beneath the grate, steady, patient, like knuckles against a coffin lid. Frank never found rest again. His porch chair became his post, the watch his prayer, the drain his horizon. His quiet retirement was gone forever, replaced by sleepless nights and questions without answers. The town grew quieter, lonelier, people whispered still, but never aloud. They avoided the curb, avoided the truth, carried their silence like a burden passed down. And on the stillest nights, when the wind died and the world held its breath, Frank swore he could hear a slow tapping from beneath the grate, steady, patient, like knuckles against a coffin lid.